Welcome to our weekly Tech Talk, everyone. I'm going to start admitting everyone who's in the waiting room, and I think Larry. I'm sorry. I'm gonna also make you a co-host, Larry, just in case. But Ron and I will keep an eye on as we get everyone in and ready to have a great conversation with Martha Wells. So I'm going to go ahead and get us kicked off. Sure, we're going to have a lot to talk about um, as we get this going. Can you guys see my screen all right?
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. Hi, Giordano. Special shout out to someone I've known all my life who's on. Thank you for joining us. So today, as you guys know, we do a tech talk every Tuesday for the most part. And today's tech talk, which is a lunch and learn, casual but informative conversation around special topics. We normally do these internally with the team inside New Light Technologies, but we also invite industry partners from around different segments of technologies and partners that we work with. Everyone from organizations like EURISA, and that's a shout out to Wendy who just joined, and to private organizations that provide software and hardware. So today we're joined by Martha Wells, who's the CEO and founder. You can clean that up for me, Martha, of Spatial Focus, who we've been a partner in one way or another, working together for almost 20 years. And it's been an amazing journey. We continue to work together on a variety of projects, and really excited about today's talk around address data management, the foundation for efficient governance and civic identity. So with that, I'm going to also introduce our co-host today from New Light Technologies. His name is Ron Goldblatt, who's our chief scientist, who is going to take it from here and keep us going. Welcome.
Yeah, thank you, G, and thank you so much, Martha, for joining us today. Maybe let's start if you can tell us a little bit about yourself, about Spatial Focus, and especially how did you become so passionate about addressing?
Well, I started out a long time ago, as you can probably tell by the gray hair, as a city planner. I was trained in that. I have a master's in city planning, goes way back. I don't even want to talk about how long ago, but I started out working in the planning field, mostly in California. And one of the things I learned was how critical addresses were to pretty much everything that happened in a local government. I worked in a small municipality. I later moved to Georgia, state of Georgia, and worked in county government in Georgia in the Atlanta area. And there again, I was struck by how much addresses mattered to pretty much everything a local government does. And as I migrated kind of away from the city planning field and community development field into GIS in the mid 80s. Again, the development of E911 at that point, it wasn't next gen then, it was E911, but we moved into addresses for emergency facilities. We had addresses in the tax assessors. We had addresses in voter registration, in the schools, in pretty much everything everybody did. And it began to sink in that was important. In 1998, Sarah Yerman and I started Spatial Focus. We're 22 years old now and counting. We've had a wonderful, wonderful partnership and just an enormous number of really wonderful clients. If I can share my screen here briefly, I have a couple of slides that.
Yeah, you're able to share. I think you're
okay. Yeah, I'm getting there. Okay, so
yeah,
let me put this into slideshow.
While you're doing that, Martha, I want to recognize Wendy Nelson, who's the director of EURISA, who's on the call as well as a few others from EURISA. So thank you for joining us.
Okay, and can everybody, let me maximize this out here. So here's a little bit real brief about Spatial Focus. As I mentioned, my partner and I are both women, so it's a woman-owned businesses. We now have a third partner who doesn't happen to be a woman, but we don't hold that against him. We've been doing this for a long time now, and our main offices are still in the Atlanta area, and I am in the DC area, Maryland. We have, over that period of time, we have agreed that we have a lot of subject matter expertise in street addressing, the data architecture that's necessary to support it, quality assurance, and GIS and data standards. We have worked since the beginning as an open source company. Our servers are all open source, as are most all of our tools. We're well familiar with most of the mainstream tools in GIS and in the database world because our clients use them, but our production environment is all open source. So we're very familiar with that environment. Sarah and I are two of the four main co-authors. I noticed Carl Anderson is on this call. He's the third one. And my husband, who's not on the call, is also a co-author. So we are co-authors of the FGDC address standard, and we are authors of the ERISA workshop and presenters of the addressing workshop for ERISA. We've done webinars, and we've done a lot of conference presentations and papers over the years on this subject. We've also just touted the standard as we've gone through this process as well. Our emphasis has been on local government address applications because that's where addresses happen. That's who has the authority to assign them and maintain them. So that's most of where we have been emphasizing our practice, our consulting practice. But we've worked with state governments, and we've worked in international situations with a variety of governmental operations, including developing an addressing system for the Emirate of Abu Dhabi in the UAE, doing some work for some municipalities in Serbia, some work in Malawi, and some work in Indonesia, all related to addressing and GIS. And then we do a lot of data cleanup, aggregation, because we find that many local governments have 10 or 12 or 15 address databases that don't match up. We can talk about that. Quality control testing, and Sarah was the one who wrote the entire quality control section of the United States address standard. And we use those tests daily in our practice. We write address ordinances and address regulations and procedures manuals, and we work on helping local governments sort out what are sometimes very convoluted workflows so that their addressing processes work better. So that's a little bit about us. And because I'm a map person, we have to have a map. This just gives you an idea of where we've been working in the last 22 years on various projects as we've gone along. And then I'll put this.
You guys did a lot of work here in DC as well, Washington, DC,
yeah.
Establishing a lot of the critical address schema and so on. So
yeah,
really near and dear to my heart.
I know. Yeah, when I first met Gurmai, when I was working in DC on their address database, that was when we first met, and they went live with their master address repository in 2003 or 4. So it was early on in our corporate career, and it's been running and still runs and is maintained very well by the DC government to this day. And it's been very valuable to them. We're currently doing a big project in the Virgin Islands, the United States Virgin Islands, which involves creating an entire addressing system. They did not have actual addresses in the Virgin Islands before we started talking about this with them. And we've been working with them. Again, we started with a plan, and we've been working into some piloting and some development of the systems and the data models for them, database models. And we've been doing field work, and we'll be back down there fairly shortly in the next couple of months doing additional field assignment of addresses based on the system that we designed. We did a lot of the design work for the Emirate of Abu Dhabi. They did all of the field assignment, but we designed the system there too. So Yeah, we've had a lot of really interesting experiences and way too much fun doing what we're doing. So I put up a couple of slides of references, and I'm happy to put these on so that they're available after this. References to standards that are out there that we'll talk about probably in the conversation, and a reference to a pretty interesting article on the value of addresses. It's not real new, but one of the most succinct discussions of why this matters to have an address in society today. So I'll be happy to put those up. And then I'm going to stop sharing my screen now.
Yeah, great, Martha. And this is exactly what I wanted to ask you. Why should we care about addresses? Why should the local government care about maintaining an accurate address database?
Well, a local government is in business to provide service to its residents and citizens. Not necessarily all citizens, but residents, whether they live there or work there or are just passing through. And those services range from the very, very time critical emergency responses. Somebody's having a medical emergency, or there's been a bad car accident or an explosion or a fire or whatever, to the more mundane things like permitting, assigning a child to a school, assigning a voter to a proper precinct. And we all know how much uproar there's been about whether the elections were conducted fairly and everybody voted where they were supposed to vote and they only voted once and all that kind of thing. Being able to get mail and so on. And local governments, pretty much if you start going into what each department in a local government has, public works, planning, tax assessment, permitting, all of those things, the school board, the voter registration people, they all use addresses all the time, but they aren't always consistent. And we've seen a number of articles where the wrong house got torn down, or a raid was, conducted against a place that the police believed was a drug house or a zone of criminal activity, and they broke in, and it was a 99-year-old grandmother who had no idea what was going on and certainly wasn't running a drug ring out of her house or anything. But it causes some dislocation. And when we take all those different databases that everybody has assembled for their own business purpose, okay, the assessor doesn't care a whole lot about whether they're registered voters out there. They care about, is this a property? What's on it? How much of a tax should they pay us? If you're trying to register a vehicle, they don't really care about whether you're an owner or a renter or what. They want to know what kind of vehicle and where does it live? Where is it garaged, so to speak? Business taxes, business licenses. And then there's the inspections. Everybody has got addresses all over them, all around them. And by creating one address database, and I think that my best story about this is from DC government. We got the database up and running, and the GIS manager at the time knew that they had about 20 of the 40 or 50 different agencies in the DC government who were using it on a regular basis, and they loved it, and they really loved it. The server crashed one night at about 4:45. And of course, everybody was running around like crazy people. And when he came in, I happened to be there at the time, and I'd come in the office early. I'd heard that I'd just come into town, and I wandered in early, and he came roaring by, and he stopped, and he said, I got to go because we got to have the server up by 9 o'clock. We promised to have it back up at 9. But he said, there are 40 agencies using this. We didn't even know about the other 20, and they've all sent me email overnight saying this is mission critical. We must have it. It's got to be up 24/7. We can't do our business without this. And that had just, if you build it, they will come. I mean, that's a kind of a trite saying, but we had built this looking at about 5 or 6 agencies using it. It had grown over 4 or 5 years into 20 agencies, except there were the other 20 out there in the shadows that we didn't even know about. And the comment that the GIS manager made was, this is the best thing we've ever done for this city. So we
If
put it
I
in
may,
one database. What?
Martha, actually, I have a story for you related directly to that same database, but why an agency needed it. One time when the decennial addressing changes happened around wards, they were changing the ward structure,
Right.
and they used the street center line for ward boundary.
Right.
And the council member got a ticket because all of a sudden the councilwoman's address was on the wrong side of the ward with the permit issue. So
Her permit parking was off. Yeah.
and she got a ticket, and she's like, "Why? I did not move. Why did I get a ticket?" So addresses have a very political nature to
Oh
them.
yeah, they do. They do. And you know, at that point, the GIS manager for the district was able to get redundant servers and, you know, hot backups and all that stuff funded. He'd been trying to fund that for a long time, but it hadn't really dawned on anybody that this mattered. And I think when you have major, you know, issues in DC, we need to know where people are and we need to know how to get to them as quickly as possible, because it's often a life or death matter. It often is. And so I think that's an important thing to think about. But they're just ubiquitous throughout local governments. The reality is local government is the authorized level of government by law in most parts of the US to assign addresses and maintain them on properties and buildings within their territory. So if there's no city there, no municipal government, it falls to the county. And so counties are in the addressing business. So are cities. States and the federal government are not in that business. They're aggregators and they're collectors of address data, but they're not in the business of saying your house, my house should be this address or that address. That's totally up to the local government. Totally. Now I'll caveat that. Federal property like federal parks, federal installations, military bases, and state installations like state universities and things like that are under the jurisdiction of either the federal agency that controls it or the state agency. So you have these occasional little islands that crop up, but for the most part, it's a local matter. It's not the post office. It's not the Census Bureau. It's not anybody at the federal level.
Even at that level, local level, Martha, I know one of the things you did here in DC, but anywhere where there's a sizable municipality, it's not just one, it's multiple agencies that create, so you'll have a lot of, I would say, push and pull on who's responsible for addressing. And I think having a unified addressing kind of helps with that as well.
It does.
Yeah, and this is related to my next question. If you can talk about the challenges and barriers associated with maintaining an up-to-date addressing.
Maintaining it and getting it collected. One of the problems is you're never going to know that you have all the addresses that are out there. Addressing started, at least here on the East Coast, back in the 1860s and 70s. So it's been going on for 150 years. And it's been done by different people over time and not always consistently. And most agencies within a city or a county government have assembled data, and we find it in everything from paper files to spreadsheets to Word files to sophisticated databases to handwritten on paper maps or Mylar maps, digital mapping. I mean, it's out there in a lot of forms, but they've collected it for their customers. Okay. I had a conversation in a county government, and the public utilities director who provided water and sewer services in the county said, well, we have all the addresses because everybody has to have water. And I said, well, you know, seems to me that the northeastern part of the county, because I'd been working in the planning department and kind of knew these things, the northeastern third of our county does not have public water. They are on well water and septic tanks. Is that not correct? Well, yes, that's correct. So you have their addresses, though, correct? Well, no, we don't have those addresses. So you don't have the complete county set of addresses. No, we have our customers. That's what you get to when you start to drill into this, is we have our customers. The assessor will have the billing address for every single parcel because they want to collect the taxes. Do they have the correct physical site address of every building? No, they don't. And they will admit that. 60% is a pretty good rate for an assessor to have of the physical addresses, as opposed to a PO box, an address out of state for rental property. Up till a couple of years ago, I still own property in another state where I used to live, and I got my tax bill just fine, but the property was still in the other state. It was not here in Maryland with me. I did not drag it along when I came up here, but I would get my tax bill faithfully. So, there are all these things that are, and I don't exist in the Prince George's County, Maryland school database because I don't have any kids in school.
Right.
My kids are grown up and off making their own babies now. And I don't have, our house doesn't appear, other than the tax bill for schools. I don't appear in that database.
That's a great question, Ron. And I think there's a question that's related to that in terms of a national roll-up from that challenge, right?
Yeah.
The US DOT is developing a national address database. Does the federal government have any plans to fund this project in the future? That's a question for Diping Lee on the chat. Just in terms of national level challenge.
Yeah. The national address database is an aggregated database. They are not developing this. The federal government has at least 3 that we know of reasonably complete address databases. They are all encumbered by various prohibitions against public distribution. One of them is census, which is covered under Title 13, which says you can't release any data that might be personally identifying for 72 years after the date that the data was collected. So at this point, the 1940 census is out there and you can look at it and see people's names, but 1950 census won't be available until next year, till 22. It's a 72-year lag. So they're covered. They can't release any information about addresses. The IRS has data. They're covered under a different title that prohibits, without a court order, the release of addresses of taxpayers under the IRS. The post office also has data, but again, there's a certain privacy statute under I think it's Title 25 for the Postal Service. So, they can't release it either. The idea, and there was a summit that Census and the Postal Service and Homeland Security and a bunch of us, ERISA was involved and NISJIC was involved and others, about creating a NAD, or a National Address Database. And we've been very involved in that process. It is a joint project of Census and the US DOT. They have minimal funding for it. And what the design for that was generally agreed on was that local governments would roll their data up to their state government, and that the state governments would aggregate all that stuff, all those 100 counties or however many counties you have, would aggregate that into a state package and roll that up to the NAD. And that there would be quality control and workflow process. I mean, it's a very involved process. We've been working on it with Census and DOT since about 2011. Right after the federal standard got approved, there was a summit about this, and then we've started having working groups and activities. There is a little bit of funding, but not much. But the states are carrying the heaviest part of the load in terms of aggregating their municipal and county level data. So yeah, there will be one, and there is a page for it. I'll see if I can't add that reference to my slides, because there is a page you can go to and see what they have, what's done and what's not done.
There's related to that challenge, Martha and Ron, Alyssa out of Texas is mentioning that in some places the utility companies are the ones who actually develop and maintain those addresses. So how do they roll into the rest of that schema? And then you've got another one where you have multiple addresses per parcel. So those kind of challenges as well.
Yeah, and some assessor websites can't show units or alternate addresses. There are many properties that have multiple addresses on them. Most of this is limitations found in legacy software. And people are beginning to change, and that the whole process with next generation 911 is about moving from range-based addresses. In other words, you're in the 1400 block of P Street in or Main Street to a specific address with a specific point location. So we're going much more granular with addresses, and data storage and data manipulation has become much less expensive and much more possible in the last 5 to 10 years. People are moving to that pretty quickly, and the next gen, the 911 community is moving into that. We're beginning to get interior things on buildings now, interior in the building information world, and people are showing suite addresses and apartment addresses, and you can have a building with hundreds of addresses in it at this point, and it's going to be changing over the next 5 to 10 years, in my estimation, as we increase that granularity at various software levels. And both Ms. Church and Ms. Thompson are correct. There are issues around this. Utilities generally, sometimes a city or county that doesn't have the people power to do what they need to do will delegate to a utility. We've seen it in the sheriff's office. We've seen it in the assessor's office. We've seen it in planning. We see it in permitting. We see it in utility departments, public works. It's all over the place. And that's why we do a lot of work with workflow, is how could we make this process more streamlined and better?
So Martha, we talked about the US. What's the status of addressing in the developing world?
Varies tremendously. Most of Europe, or Western Europe, I would say, was addressed as far back as the 16th century. As cities got too big for people to know everybody, then they would start naming streets, and often streets were named for, this is the street where the tailors all the people who make fabric or clothing, and this is the street where the blacksmiths are, and this is the street, and they would name it Blacksmith Street or Taylor Street or Cooper Street or some of those kind of things. But it gave a way for people to identify, and then they would number buildings, sometimes just randomly and sometimes in some kind of order. It goes back a long ways in places like Paris and London and many of the cities in Western Europe. When you get to the developing world, what we found is major streets seem to get names. Minor streets seem not to have names. They're just there. And people describe their locations. You go down this street to the third mango tree and the little blue house, and you turn right, and then you go left at the soursop bush or whatever. And what that does is it doesn't work very well. And as people have become more digitally literate, I mean, cell phones have become a thing, but you get down, when we started working in the Virgin Islands, and this is a U.S. territory for that matter, you couldn't say, I want to go to Ron's house, I want to go to Wendy's house, and her address is such and such, because she didn't have an address. One of our colleagues down there, when he wants to get a taxi to the airport, he has to tell them to come to a particular crossroads that's about a quarter mile from his house, because they can never find his house. So he walks down there with all his stuff, and the taxi comes to that intersection because that has some kind of a sign on it. It's really tough. And one of the things that, in the article that I've got the reference up for, what they say, and I've got, let me put that. I have a quote here. And this is from colleagues of ours in South Africa, because there's one aspect of address value that is uniquely highlighted in the South African context: the fact that an address gives a social status to a citizen. During the apartheid era in South Africa, many were not given addresses, which reinforced their lack of proper status as a citizen of the country. The benefits of addresses in the South African context are applicable to other countries as well. we conclude that it is important to a country's economy, society, and governance to assign an address, to have a properly defined address system, and to have an address standard according to which addresses are assigned, maintained, and exchanged. And what that really says is, if you don't have an address, you can't open a bank account. You can't get somebody to give you a phone that you're paying, you need to pay over time for. You can't get a loan on your property. You can't get, you can't apply for a job and say, well, send me a letter if I got hired or not, because where do they send it? All these things are denied. The response we've been getting in the Virgin Islands is, they say, well, what are you doing? We tell them what we're doing. We're assigning addresses to all the property. And they say, does that mean I'm going to be able to get packages from Amazon? Well, yes, it does. In fact, it does. And whether you like Amazon or hate them, but it also means you get packages from other people as well, including your family and friends, and you have an actual location that those things can come to. The other thing we hear about, ran into a fellow on the street. I was out with another woman assigning addresses on a little back street, and we told him what we were doing. He says, no, stay right here. I just came out of my mother's house. She needs to hear this because she often has to call 911 because she has a breathing problem. And the ambulance comes and gives her some oxygen and then she's okay, but they can never find her. She needs to know that she's got an address now that she can tell them and they'll know where to find her. And she won't die. I mean, this is the kind of response you get. And we got that in Africa. The countries we worked in there, we got it even in smaller towns in Serbia, which, it's a different area. We've seen it all over. Puerto Rico is working on this problem now. Other Caribbean islands are also working on it. It's a massive issue. You can't join this century. You can have your cell phone. You might even have your computer with Wi-Fi, but you can't receive packages. You can't get medical aid because nobody knows where you are. And your cell phone may throw off a set of coordinates, but that doesn't route necessarily as well as it might. So I think it's a massive thing. And in South Africa, they said it really conferred full citizenship on a great deal of the population. And that in itself is an enormous economic engine.
I'm really, it never occurred to me to look at it that way, to be honest with you. And I could totally see what developmental and equity issues arise.
Yeah.
And are challenged by that. That's a excellent.
Well, yeah, and we've even seen it on the tribal lands. When I was first working in this, I was down in New Mexico teaching a workshop for the university. And there was a woman from San Juan County, New Mexico, which is it's right at the Four Corners area out there. And she said, do you know how long the average time is for a 911 response on the Navajo land? And I said, no. And she said, it's 8 hours. 8 hours to get an ambulance to come out. And she said, nobody calls because they just put the person in the car and drive them. It's faster.
You got to plan your emergencies, I suppose.
Yeah, right. Kid falls out of the tree and breaks their arm. You just put them in the car and drive them. You just have to, or they die because they can't get medical help, or the house burns to the ground because they can't get there fast enough. And that's to me is really unconscionable that that kind of thing is allowed to exist here, but it's also very common in sub-Saharan Africa, parts of Asia, even in wealthy oil-rich emirates in the Middle East who have no addressing systems. They had the same problems. And it's really all about, where are you? What is your location? And that's one of the first things after they say, what's your issue? Why are you calling 911? They say, where are you? And sometimes that's very hard to describe because not everybody's familiar.
Yeah. So now I have a tough question. Can addressing be used by governments for political purposes or to
Sure.
implement an agenda? If you can give examples.
Well, redistricting is one that's going on right now, where the way in which people are counted and which addresses are counted or not counted, that can be very political. We're looking at that, and there's a lot of work in the GIS community. Our colleague Mark Salling at Cleveland State up in Ohio has been working on this with a lot of people to start getting nonpartisan groups to work with that and to get better address data to work with the redistricting issue. We found where in the about between 2 and 3 years before the every 10-year census in this country, there's a program called LUCA, which is the local update of census addresses. And since census can't make their addresses public, it's sort of each jurisdiction that wants to participate reports their list of addresses, and census will give you the addresses for that jurisdiction, and then you can kind of see, do they line up or do they not line up? We had a couple of jurisdictions that we were helping with that before the 2010 census. And we found in one county about 15,000 addresses that were not in the census database, that were in the county's database. Another county we found, I think, between 8 and 10,000. Now, each household represents a couple of people, on average, 2 point something. Every person that's not counted is worth $2,000 to $3,000 worth of federal aid every year for the next 10 years. So what happens is jurisdictions who don't count well or census doesn't count well because they don't know that those addresses are out there, you can have a real, and you always hear the howling after the census is done about undercounting. Part of the reason is that census's addresses often are incomplete because they don't have the funding or the people to get out and make sure they have all the addresses. And if the local governments participate and push that stuff in, it increases. And if you multiply 15,000 addresses times, say, 2.3, you're talking probably 40,000 per capita people, and 40,000 times 3,000 or 5,000 a year in federal subvention money over 10 years is tens and hundreds of millions of dollars that would not come into that community for health, for all kinds of other education money, health money, social services, roads, infrastructure, all kinds of stuff. So a lot of that's really important. And that's where I see it as political.
So Martha, there is a comment in the chat about the use of addresses in disaster management. Can you talk about the role of addresses in disaster response, recovery planning?
Very important. It's particularly in the Mountain West. It's a particularly big thing with the forest fires that they've been having. How do you know who's out there in the mountain areas? They're often very sparsely populated, but there are people, there are houses. Boulder County in Colorado lost 30 houses that they didn't even know had gotten built because nobody ever took out a permit for them. And so there were houses up there that had no address, that weren't on the radar, that were not in the thing, and those houses burned to the ground. Fortunately, nobody was hurt. They saw the fire. The people up there saw the fire coming and got out of the way, but their houses, and nobody went to fight the fire up there because they didn't know there were houses up there. County had no knowledge of it. And the other thing is the addresses, having a good address system and having knowledge of it is really important. We see firefighters from Idaho and Montana fighting forest fires in Arizona. They're not going to know the local road names. They're not going to know addresses in that area. They've never been there before. It's like if I go to a city I've never been to, I don't know how to find anything there. Addresses are a systematic, visible, on the ground, street signs, numbers on buildings, system that you can navigate even without an electronic device, and you can navigate it, from your maps. You can navigate to it via your road system. And in dealing with large scale disasters, it's really critical. I mean, we're bringing in California last year, they brought in Australian firefighters, literally, folks that were trained in that kind of, mountain wilderness firefighting. And, it's important to know what's out there. And that's where having a really good addressing system helps everybody. Anybody could go there and say, there should be people there and we need to get them out. We need to save, their property, their lives.
Great point there. I think, Ron, towards that question on political sphere of addressing, you can also look at the push and pull from the citizens' view of the government. And Alyssa Church highlighting that some people don't want their addresses known or have an address, let's say. And so but there's a converse need for emergency response, where there's a natural conflict there, I suppose.
Well, yeah, I would say you're right that the question becomes one of, somebody says, well, I don't want to have an address because that means you're going to control my life, and you're going to make me get permits and all that. And we say, well, okay, sign this disclaimer that says if you decide to have a heart attack, or your child falls out of the second story window and needs an ambulance, that we don't have to come. We don't have your address on our books. We don't know where you are, and we may get there, we may not, but we don't have to come. They go, well, maybe this might be more important than you think.
Probably we'll touch on Ron's next set of questions, but there's a question around open standards and projects around the world. So, but I'd rather go back to Ron's question. I think that might lead into some of the next things.
Yeah, go ahead, Ron.
Yeah, so we talked about addressing. How is addressing done in practice? I mean, do we rely on surveyors who walk and map buildings? How is it done?
Well, there are lots of ways to do it. We've identified a number of sort of systems that are in use around the world. A lot of places we've found that the system's already there. So adding on, if you build a new subdivision or whatever, is a matter of knowing what your system is. And I refer to that as address forensics, detective work. And it's kind of a lot of fun to look at a map and start thinking about, well, how does this work? And you'll note that a lot of southern communities in the US, the courthouse is the starting point for the addressing, and it radiates out from there. Some other places, Minnesota seems to address from the southeast corner and goes north and west with the numbering. Places, Boulder County, I always love Boulder County because the eastern half of Boulder County in Colorado is flat. It's flat as a pancake. The western half of Boulder County is kind of straight up and down. It's very, very mountainous. The transition happens very, very rapidly. There's not like little foothills. It's like flat and mountain. And they have two systems. They have the flatland system for addressing, which is a grid laid out in squares. They have the mountain system, which is all about the distance along a road that you have gone. And they put an address they have the ability to address every 1,000th of a mile, which what that works into, if you go back to that grid, they have blocks of 100 addresses and they are 1/10 of a mile. So 10/10ths of a mile works out to 1,000 addresses, right? It all works pretty nicely, but they just do it off the mileposts and they use that 1,000th of a mile calculation, and they can send somebody out with a car even that can track 1/10ths of a mile and get it, pretty close. And then they take out the little wheel thing. They don't really need a surveyor for that. If you're talking about an area that has nothing, then the way we've approached it is to figure out where the starting point for the addressing should be. We use 1,000 per mile because that's partly it's an emergency management NENA 911 standard. It makes sense, and it's what's in use in a lot of places. So we're not doing something really arguably different. So we say, okay, if we decide we're going to start here, sometimes it's the center of the capital city or the major town in the area. And we work our way out using the road grid to start with. That helps us identify what we refer to as potential addresses. So we put all 1,000 points along the center line. It looks really messy, but there it is. And of course, we separate even and odd numbers. That helps people kind of figure out what's going on. And then we go out and walk along those streets. We come to a building. We've been using some really nice little handheld collectors, little Trimble collectors. And we have an app on there, and we show the map, and we show all those 1,000 points, and we stand, and our little position shows up, our little position dot shows up. We see what number is the right number for that building, and we assign that address, and we record it on the collector, and then we upload that into QGIS and ultimately, in some cases, into an Esri environment. But we get all that mapping done. It's a bit slow, but we can, we go and sometimes drive and then walk a ways, and drive and walk a ways, and depends on the density of development. And that's what we did in Abu Dhabi. We didn't have the great collectors we have now, but that's how it was being done in Abu Dhabi as well.
Yeah, so you mentioned the collectors. If you can talk a little bit about technology, how did it change in the last few years?
Well, the collectors we have now, and I think there probably are others, these are the ones we're particularly using, have the ability to display the map. They have a little screen, just maybe 3 inches square, but it's not much bigger. They aren't much bigger than a large cell phone. And you can carry one around pretty much all day without breaking your arm off with the weight of it. It's not very heavy. But it displays the map, it displays the area you're in, and it displays the points that you've assigned, and also all the potential points and the street names and the property parcels, so we can see that, and the building footprints. And the building footprints that we're using in the Virgin Islands came from OpenStreetMap. They were done after the hurricanes down there in 2017, and they're not terrifically accurate, but they're a really good reference. The parcels came from the government. We're using those. The parcel layer's in there, the center line layer is in there, and we've developed all the address points. So we're working with all that data in front of us. We built a little application under Android to collect about 4 or 5 other facts about that property. Is this a multiple unit facility or a single occupancy place? Is it accessible by a vehicle? So forth. And it also captures a photograph. And the reason we do that is that because if somebody comes in and says, well, you're telling me this is my address, we can say, is this your building? Show them the picture right there on the screen that's attached to that property, to that building. And they can say, no, you got it wrong. Or, yeah, that's my building. Yeah, that's right. And we have that verification of what was there, at least at the time we captured it. And those little collectors are wonderful, and they take in a geo package, which is a pretty neat little thing, and spit one back out. And we load that up into open source quantum GIS QGIS, and we're using a Postgres backend for uploading all the data as we do it. But we can look at it and run spatial QC on it in a GIS environment. And it's really great technology. They're not terribly expensive, and they really work. And it's been easy to teach people to do the work in the field. They get pretty proficient at it after about 2 or 3 days. So it doesn't take long to get people up and running with it. And the good news is that then if there's new development or something changes, we can send them back out with the same collector, and they have all that information right in front of them.
This is a great conversation. I just wanted to chime in here, let you guys know we're about 10 minutes out for the hour. And I know Ronnie had a couple more areas to cover. I wanted to throw it back at you, but there's some evolving technology ideas that are like what Dana mentioned around blockchain. And the UN GGIM, the Geographic Standards Organization for the UN, has an addressing program. So there's a bunch of things going on there. But I want to see if we can loop that in with, I think, some of the sustainability questions that Ron had.
Yeah, maybe another question about technology, if you can talk about technology for data management. So not just collecting the data, but what type of services, for example, you provide, to help maintain the data?
Well, we generally, when we're doing data cleanup for places that already have addresses in place, we run it through we run it through all the tests that are appropriate for the part of the data or the type of data we have, spatial and tabular data, using tools that we've developed for that purpose. We also have a partner that has developed a really good maintenance application that works in the Esri environment and works with the databases that we create. We generally produce fairly complex relational databases, so multiple tables, multiple relationships, a lot of stuff with a lot of scripted views, which means that a person that, or an agency that holds the central database for, say, a county can say, okay, 911, how do you want to see this data? And that scripted view that we would provide gives them the data exactly the way they want to see it, with whatever abbreviations or whatever truncations or whatever order the fields need to be in. And then they can turn right around and say, okay, tax assessor, what do you want to see? And schools, what do you want to see? And we can give them the data the way they want to see it and in the form they want to see it. But at the same time, we know that the integrity of the data behind it is good. And we run those tests periodically and fairly religiously to be sure that things aren't creeping or getting badly done. We try to use a lot of domains within the fields in the database so that people are not typing, they're picking off lists, so that we don't get typographical errors or, as we put it, fat finger errors where they type a 2 when they meant a 3 or vice versa. So the blockchain question has not come up. I haven't seen that yet, and I don't know. I can't really comment on the viability of that in terms of.
Before we even go to blockchain, Martha, I think that there's another conversation around the spatial orientation of everything, having a common framework to begin with, that are they're local, national, international, that's become hindered. And there's the legal jurisdictions, very matter, very political about who has what address where and how. But blockchain does have some potential from what I've read, but there's still a ways out for that.
Yeah, and it may be more where there's, I mean, addresses in the purest sense don't have any financial connection. I mean, they are a representation of a location, but they aren't a legal document or legal ID for much of anything at this point, at least in most of the title registries that I've seen. There's usually a surveyed legal description that would have to be referenced in the whatever documentation you put. And addresses do change over time. I mean, where I live now in Maryland, my street names changed, I think, at least once, if not twice, since the house was built. Not since I've been here, but before that, I mean, if I look up my original plat, the street name's totally different. So, and but the description, the lot number and the unit of the subdivision and the subdivision name didn't change. That's the legal framework for my property. I mean, I'm a lot in a subdivision in a town, but yeah, things do change, and zip codes change and street names change, and sometimes the numbering gets changed for some reason. And so the address is fairly mutable, unfortunately. So that's something that the maintenance process needs to be able to cope with that. And the maintenance app that we generally work with does have the facility to go in and change a street name. And it's done in the database. It's based on the street segments and what name or names are applied, because many streets have several names. They have a federal route number, a state route number, maybe a county highway designation or county road designation, and a local name, or 2 or 3. Very common. So it's the problem is that they can be very complex, and you can be in one postal jurisdiction and in a different administrative jurisdiction. My postal jurisdiction here in Maryland happens to be Hyattsville, but I live in a town called University Park, which is a legal, organized, incorporated town. But the post office thinks I'm in Hyattsville, which is the next town over, and I don't live there. But that's what my zip code says. So I'm always fighting with the merchant, the online merchants, about, you know, where do I really live? And that can have some really big consequences, and most people don't even think about it. If I went ahead and allowed that default Hyattsville to go on a lot of stuff, at the end of the year, when the state of Maryland distributes property tax and other sales taxes and income taxes, they distribute it on the name of the city that you put on your tax return. So if I let it go to what the tax program says, all of the taxes that I paid in would go to Hyattsville and not to the town I live in. And every year we have to do a big thing with the residents of University Park, where I do live, to say, be sure you put University Park on there, because otherwise we lose money big time. So things like that happen.
This is just the tip of the iceberg. There's so many tangents to this.
Oh, I could go on all day.
There's a 3D addressing conversation that just picked up, for example.
Yep.
Technology.
Oh, yeah.
And 3D space, as in the future, as you get more and more high rises, is it sufficient just if someone lives 120 floors above somewhere, or are they in a different jurisdiction altogether? But Ron, I'm gonna throw back to you. But before I close, I do want to highlight that you can all reach Martha at spatialfocus.com. And with our recent strategic partnership, you can reach us, and we have a relationship to be able to leverage and work with Martha's team on a variety of projects. And I think Ron is going to tidy that up a little bit.
Yeah, no, Martha, I just wanted to thank you a lot for a great discussion. I think that the discussion illustrated that addresses are not just a piece of data or another, GIS layer. It also provides an identity, civic identity, as we discussed, and a complete addressing system is essential for effective governance. And personally, as partners of Spatial Focus, I'm looking forward to being part of your mission, Martha, to ensure that all people, especially those vulnerable and marginalized people, will have documented addresses and recognition and identity.
Yeah, we're very excited about those kind of projects all over the world as to how we can make that happen for people. Yeah. All humans deserve to be recognized as full humans, full people, full citizens of the world.
Right.
So, yeah, I'd be happy to carry on, bits and pieces. There are lots of really good comments here, and I'd be happy to do that. My email is out there, and it's on the slides that I'll get to Jeremiah and Ron to attach with the video from this, or the recording of this.
Definitely. We're going to work with our team that's going to deploy this video to the YouTube channel, and then, add that content right there. So anyone who wants to review it with the video and go from there. Wow. This, it's not going to end. Ron, you're going to have to end us here, I think.
No, I mean, I think this was the best tech talk we had. The most interesting for me, at least.
I've enjoyed it. So, and I will talk about addresses a lot. So if we get, maybe if there are enough requests for an additional session on some aspect of this, rather than just kind of a general session, I'm happy to put that together. I'll work with you on it.
So thank you so much. And thank you, everybody, for attending. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Right.
Bye.
Stay tuned for the next one. And
Yes.
see you then. Bye, guys.
Bye.
Bye.